The classical theory of crime stands as one of the most foundational and intellectually significant frameworks in criminology, emerging during the Enlightenment period of the 18th century, when thinkers began to systematically challenge the brutal and arbitrary nature of feudal justice systems that had dominated European societies for centuries. Before we delve into understanding this revolutionary approach to understanding criminal behavior, let's consider a practical scenario. Imagine a young person standing outside a luxury electronics store, weighing the decision to steal an expensive smartphone, consciously calculating the potential profit they could make by selling it against the risk of being caught, arrested, and facing imprisonment. And in that moment of deliberation, they are embodying the core principle of classical criminology, which posits that individuals are rational actors who consciously choose to commit crimes after evaluating the costs and benefits of their actions. The classical theory of crime, primarily developed through the groundbreaking work of philosophers and legal reformers such as Cesare Beccaria, Jeremy Bentham, and John Howard in the late 1700s, fundamentally revolutionized how societies conceptualized criminal behavior by rejecting the prevailing medieval and early modern belief that crime was the result of supernatural forces, demonic possession, or predetermined fate, and instead proposing that crime was a rational choice made by free-willed individuals who possessed the capacity to reason and calculate consequences. Cesare Beccaria, an Italian legal reformer whose 1764 publication, An Essay on Crimes and Punishments, became the intellectual cornerstone of classical criminology, argued with unprecedented clarity that the purpose of the criminal justice system should not be the public torture and execution of offenders as a spectacle of state power, but rather the swift, certain, and proportionate punishment of criminal acts, arguing that certainty of punishment was more effective in deterring crime than severity, meaning that a high likelihood of arrest and conviction would deter potential offenders far more effectively than the threat of brutal torture or execution. To illustrate this principle with a contemporary example, consider how the installation of visible surveillance cameras in parking lots has been shown to reduce car theft rates dramatically, not because the punishment for theft is more severe, but because potential offenders perceive a higher likelihood of being caught and identified. Thus, the certainty rather than the severity of consequences shapes their decision-making calculus. Jeremy Bentham, a British philosopher and legal theorist who further developed classical criminology through his principle of utilitarianism, extended Beccaria's insights by proposing that human beings are fundamentally motivated by the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, a concept known as hedonistic calculus or philosophic calculus, which meant that rational individuals would commit crimes only when they perceived that the benefits or pleasure derived from the criminal act would outweigh the pain or punishment they risked incurring, and therefore the role of the criminal justice system should be to increase the pain associated with criminal behavior through punishment so that this cost-benefit analysis would shift against criminal activity. Imagine a person contemplating breaking into a residential home to commit burglary. If that person calculates that they might obtain items worth several $1,000s, but faces a substantial likelihood of arrest, prosecution, conviction, and a prison sentence of several years, the rational actor in classical theory would determine that the expected value of the crime is negative, that is, the expected punishment outweighs the expected gain, and therefore they would choose not to commit the crime, demonstrating how classical theory views crime as a product of rational economic calculation rather than psychological disorder, moral deficiency, or social pathology. The classical theory of crime is built upon several core assumptions and principles that fundamentally distinguish it from other criminological theories that emerged later, particularly the positivist schools of criminology that would develop in the 19th and 20th centuries. And the first and most essential assumption is that human beings possess free will and the capacity to make conscious choices about their behavior, meaning that individuals are not slaves to biological impulses, psychological compulsions, or social forces, but rather autonomous agents capable of deliberation and decision-making. The second critical principle is that individuals are rational actors who engage in a process of reasoning wherein they consciously calculate the potential benefits of an action against the potential costs or punishments, weighing expected pleasure against expected pain. And this rational calculation is the determinant of whether they choose to commit a criminal act or conform to the law. For example, a person considering whether to commit fraud by falsifying their resume to obtain a high-paying job position would, according to classical theory, consciously evaluate the probability of detection, the likelihood of prosecution if detected, the severity of potential punishment, such as criminal charges and imprisonment, against the material benefits they would gain from obtaining the position and the salary increase, and only if the expected benefits exceed the expected costs would they rationally decide to commit the fraudulent act. The third fundamental principle is that the severity of punishment is less important than its certainty and swiftness in deterring criminal behavior, meaning that a high probability of being caught and quickly punished is more effective in preventing crime than the threat of extremely severe but unlikely punishment. And this principle represented a dramatic departure from medieval and early modern justice systems that featured extremely brutal punishments but highly inconsistent enforcement. The fourth principle is that punishments should be proportionate to the offense, meaning that the severity of punishment should correspond logically to the seriousness of the crime. And both Beccaria and Bentham argued that excessive punishments were not only inhumane and unjust, but also counterproductive, as they would not significantly increase deterrence beyond what a proportionate punishment would achieve. Consider the example of how most modern legal systems now impose more severe punishments for violent crimes than for property crimes, reflecting the classical principle that punishment should be proportionate to the harm caused and the seriousness of the offense, as this proportionality ensures that the punishment system operates fairly and efficiently in deterring the most harmful behaviors. The deterrence mechanism proposed by classical criminology operates on two distinct levels, specific deterrence and general deterrence, and understanding this distinction is crucial to grasping how classical theory explains why punishment prevents crime. Specific deterrence refers to the preventative effect of punishment on the individual who has been punished, meaning that when a person is arrested, convicted, and punished for committing a crime, the experience of punishment should deter that particular individual from committing crimes in the future because they have now experienced firsthand the unpleasant consequences of criminal activity, and their rational calculations have been updated with this empirical knowledge. For instance, a young person who was caught shoplifting, arrested, taken to juvenile court, and required to perform community service or placed on probation may be specifically deterred from stealing again because they have now experienced the negative consequences of this behavior, the embarrassment, the legal process, the disruption to their life, the restrictions on their freedom, and their future rational calculations regarding theft will incorporate this painful experience as evidence of the actual costs of such behavior. General deterrence, by contrast, refers to the preventative effect of punishment on the general population, meaning that when potential offenders observe that others who commit crimes are caught, prosecuted, and punished, they are deterred from committing the same crimes because they understand from these observable examples that criminal behavior will likely result in negative consequences for them as well. Consider how news reports about successful prosecutions of financial fraud cases can deter other potential white-collar criminals, as individuals who are contemplating committing fraud become aware that law enforcement has the capability and motivation to detect and prosecute such crimes, and therefore the rational choice becomes to refrain from engaging in fraud, as the likelihood and consequences of punishment have been made salient through the publicized cases of others. The implications of classical criminology theory extended far beyond abstract philosophy and had profound practical effects on the development of modern criminal justice systems throughout Europe and North America in the 19th century, as legal reformers drawing on classical principles began implementing systematic changes to how crimes were defined, how procedures were conducted, and how punishments were administered. Classical theory provided the intellectual justification for replacing arbitrary and brutal judicial discretion with written legal codes that clearly specified which acts constituted crimes and what punishments they carried, as this was seen as necessary to ensure that all individuals, regardless of their social status or relationship to those in power, would face consistent and proportionate punishment for the same offenses. The development of written constitutions and bills of rights in democratic nations drew heavily on classical principles, particularly the requirement that laws be clearly written and published in advance, that individuals not be subjected to cruel and unusual punishment, and that the severity of punishment correspond to the severity of the offense. And these protections represented the practical implementation of classical criminological ideas in the structure of legal systems. Classical theory also provided intellectual support for the professionalization and rationalization of law enforcement and the judiciary, as the emphasis on certain and swift punishment led to the development of police forces whose role was to increase the likelihood of detecting and apprehending offenders, and this represented a fundamental shift from earlier systems where law enforcement was sporadic and dependent on private individuals or local authorities pursuing grievances. However, classical criminology also faced significant criticisms and limitations that emerged as the theory was tested against empirical reality and as new criminological perspectives developed, particularly as 19th-century thinkers began developing positivist criminology, which challenged the classical assumption that all individuals possessed equal rational capacity and equal access to legal penalties, and argued instead that biological, psychological, and social factors constrained human rationality and affected individuals differently based on their characteristics. One major limitation of classical theory is that it assumes all individuals possess equal capacity for rational calculation and equal access to legal information. But in reality, rational capacity varies significantly among individuals based on age, cognitive development, mental health status, and education level, meaning that young children, individuals with severe intellectual disabilities, and individuals experiencing severe mental illness may not possess the capacity for the kind of rational deliberation that classical theory presumes. For example, a child of 7 years old may not have the cognitive development necessary to fully understand the consequences of stealing candy from a store in the way that an adult would, and therefore the classical deterrence model may not operate effectively for young children regardless of how certain or swift the punishment is, as their rational capacity for understanding long-term consequences is still developing. Another significant limitation is that classical theory focuses exclusively on rational decision-making in a vacuum and does not adequately account for the role of emotional states, impulsivity, and situational factors in criminal behavior, as empirical research has consistently shown that many crimes, particularly violent crimes, occur in moments of high emotion, where the individual is not engaging in careful, rational calculation of costs and benefits, but rather acting in response to anger, fear, humiliation, or other intense emotional states that override rational deliberation. Additionally, classical criminology was criticized for failing to consider how economic desperation and social disadvantage might constrain the choices available to individuals or create situations where the rational calculation shifts dramatically, as a person facing homelessness and starvation might rationally determine that the risk of prosecution for theft is worth the certainty of obtaining food and resources necessary for survival, meaning that the adequacy of classical theory's explanatory power depends significantly on assumptions about individuals' economic circumstances and access to legitimate opportunities. Despite these criticisms and limitations, classical criminology has experienced a remarkable resurgence in influence within modern criminology and criminal justice policy, particularly through the development of rational choice theory and deterrence theory in the late 19th century, as contemporary criminologists recognized that, while classical theory was incomplete, it captured something fundamentally important about human behavior, that individuals indeed engage in decision-making processes that weigh costs and benefits, and that legal punishments do affect these calculations. The rational choice perspective in modern criminology has evolved classical theory to incorporate insights about how individuals actually make decisions under conditions of incomplete information, time pressure, and emotional arousal, recognizing that rationality is bounded and context-dependent rather than perfect and abstract. Modern criminal justice systems continue to incorporate classical principles in their fundamental structure, such as the emphasis on proportionality in sentencing, the requirement of due process protections, the presumption of innocence, and the principle that punishment should be certain and swift rather than arbitrary and delayed, reflecting the enduring practical wisdom of classical criminological principles, even as modern criminology has developed more sophisticated understandings of the causes of crime. In conclusion, classical criminology represents a pivotal moment in the history of Western thought, when thinkers applied principles of rationality, philosophy, and human rights to the problem of crime and punishment, creating a framework that revolutionized how societies conceptualized criminal justice, and that continues to influence modern legal systems, criminal justice policy, and criminological thinking in the 21st century, demonstrating that ideas developed in the 18th century by philosophers like Cesare Beccaria